Tell me about working at SCAP.
Well, I worked there for 4 years, and as I said, I was the first full-time hired person as the coordinator of volunteers. It was a very powerful time in my life to do that kind of work. I felt like this was my form of social activism. I was really honored to work there. It was very, very challenging. I oriented, as the volunteer coordinator, I oriented about 1,000 volunteers over 4 years. So if you want to do the numbers, that's something like, we would have a volunteer orientation every 2 weeks. It'd be like, okay, every other Wednesday there's an open volunteer orientation, so come on down if you want to volunteer at the Santa Cruz AIDS Project. And that was often between 15 and 35 people. So if you add that all up on a monthly basis, twice a month, that's how you end up with about 1,000 people that we oriented over a 4-year period. Now, there's no way that we could manage and absorb 1,000 volunteers. So about half of them went away after the volunteer orientation, which was a 2-hour intensive that included about an hour of nuts and bolts about HIV transmission and how it worked, and about a half an hour, 40 minutes about the Santa Cruz AIDS Project and how it worked and where you might fit in, and about 15 or 20 minutes about AIDS policy, about what's important to know about AIDS in terms of the media and government issues. So I was delighted that we oriented that many people. It was always a come one, come all. We had many university students and people from all walks of life. It was a very, very wide catch-all. And it didn't matter that half of them went away because we couldn't have absorbed them and used them all, and we wanted people to be educated about the AIDS epidemic and less afraid. So the fact that some people came and they got a deeper education directly from the Santa Cruz AIDS Project about HIV, how HIV was spread and how it was not spread, and about what the policy issues were and about how the organization worked was all valuable to us. So of those 500 people that were left, we put them into various categories based on what they said they thought they might be interested in. And the two major thrusts of the Santa Cruz AIDS Project in the beginning were education and prevention and care for those that were HIV positive or who had AIDS or who were dying. And so those were like the two major wings. There was always the executive wing, the administrative wing that Gerald was running, the fundraising wing, the administrative wing, and then there was these two thrusts. And that's pretty much the nature of how the organization was when I left 4 years later. It was still set up and structured in that way. The departments that we've set up were just again, in response to what we thought was needed. It was very dramatic, of course, to have people that would call up and say that they have AIDS or their brother had AIDS and they were dying of AIDS. And we put in this buddy system, which was modeled a bit after hospice and maybe a little bit after Shanti. But a lot of what we did was very homegrown. I mean, we did look at other organizations and how they worked, but they had different levels of funding, different volumes of support and structure. And we were a small organization in a small community. So we basically were very grassroots in how we developed what we developed. I was talking recently with a person who is a major Shanti volunteer up in San Francisco, who was a major Shanti volunteer, and he said, well, you know, we had a lot of this. I was writing some memoir work, and he said, we had a lot of this structure too. I'm not sure that y'all invented this the way that it sounds like. And I thought to myself, well, maybe we didn't invent it. Maybe we just created or recreated what was obvious. When people are sick, for example, we often had two levels of care. One would be an emotional support buddy. And that buddy would go through about a 25 to 35 hour training. It usually involved 2 intensive weekends and 2 or 3 or 4 weeknights. So before we took volunteers and said, well, why don't you just pair up with this person who's dying of this disease, let us prepare you first. Let us give you a support structure. Let us teach you what some of the issues are that might come up. And as I said, this wasn't all brand new. We didn't invent it from scratch. It was being used in other places, but we did our own version here for sure. So we had buddies, and they were there designated to just be present for people who were, we perceived, going through a process of dying, and often very young people. Sometimes they might have been as old as 50 or 60, but more often they were 25 to 45. Then we had people who said, I don't know if I can really manage the emotional strain of talking to somebody about death and dying or all the losses, but I'd want to be there. I want to help them out. And I could do their laundry, or I could clean their house, or I could walk their dog, or I could drive them to the pharmacy, or I could pick up their medications. And we called those people practical support volunteers. And of course the lines blurred. And those are the roles that we put people in because that's how we sort of structured it. Everybody went through training, but the people who did practical support sometimes became the best friend, and the people who were designated as buddies sometimes did all kinds of pragmatic and practical things for them, for their clients as well. And that was a very difficult thing to do, to mentor and to hold the energetic field of 25 and 35 and 45-year-olds dying very early, dying often alone, sometimes dying with a deep sense of shame, a sense of remorse, isolated often from their families, rejected from their families, sometimes rejected from the medical community at large, sometimes in fear of letting their landlords know what was wrong with them. Some people that we worked with that had AIDS were very, very afraid of anybody finding out about it, and confidentiality was of the utmost importance, and other people were very queer activist oriented and wanted to be out and proud and overcome their shame by being free to say what was true about them. And so we had all ranges of that. Eventually we even had people come in who wanted to do other kinds of support. We had a whole volunteer massage program because so many people came in that were massage practitioners. They said, I would like to do a massage twice a month to people with AIDS or the volunteers who are working with them or the staff. So we had about 12 or 15 massage practitioners doing 1 or 2 massages that we could designate per month, which was a huge, huge valuable community resource. I mean, the idea of being touched and being held and being connected and being intimate with somebody was very, very important to those clients, as well as some of the staff and the volunteers who also needed to be nurtured and supported. We had a person who wanted to put a pause program in place, which was a little bit of a model after San Francisco, which is people who could bring in a dog to hang out and be somebody's companion for an afternoon, an evening, a week, multiple times. And of course we had a food bank that eventually got developed because a lot of people with AIDS got impoverished. If you were living on Social Security or disability at the age of 30, you got about $550 or $600 a month to live on. And that was it. And if your energy flagged and you were struggling to survive and take care of yourself and go to doctor's appointments and then be sick all at the same time, people weren't really able to work for a very long time. People did not have that strength and stamina. So a food bank in the beginning of the AIDS epidemic was necessary and sort of vital for a lot of our clients. Of course, there were clients that were very middle class and had good resources and whose family didn't reject them. We had all kinds of ranges of clients, and there we were to work with all of them. We had a very strong mental health component. We had another dozen, maybe 15, 18 mental health therapists in the community who came together as a mental health team. And they offered support groups, individual therapy, assessments, and that was another wing of the department the department, I would say, of direct care. So volunteers got shifted into all of those, and as a volunteer coordinator, I had my hands on all of it because I needed to shape and configure how this would work, how we would train people, how we would assess people, how we would assign people, what kind of support the volunteers needed, how people would work together with their clients and get supervision as well if things were going difficultly. So that was a big piece of it. And then we had volunteers who wanted to stop the epidemic, who didn't want to see it go any further. They wanted to go upriver and get people from falling in the river. So that was a whole other wing that we developed, HIV prevention. And of course, it started out with safer sex, and then it developed into a very strong needle exchange program which was not officially a part of the Santa Cruz AIDS Project. Because of our funding and because of our reputation, in the very beginning, needle exchange was considered very edgy, and if we thought gay men were stigmatized, IV needle users were more stigmatized, even more profoundly stigmatized. So we were advocates for everything that needed to get done. So we were advocates for needle exchange. There was a separate independent needle exchange program, and then they spun off and became in certain ways their own independent organization, I think, right out of the Santa Cruz AIDS Project. But there was all kinds of very dynamic HIV prevention work that was being done, and eventually we hired quite early, I think, Ruth Moda, who had a master's in public health and was a professional health educator. And she took over that whole wing. And we had a very powerful speakers bureau where people with AIDS and HIV would speak directly to audiences where they were called in and invited to talk about their illness. Because one of the things that we found very early on, especially to young people or to people who were in denial about the AIDS epidemic, which everybody wanted to be in denial. I mean, nobody wanted this to happen. Nobody wanted to believe that this could happen to their community or especially to them. I think denial is a very healthy psychological process and one that really made it useful for us. I mean, made it possible for us to go on and to go forward, was to be in denial about a lot of things. But of course, denial has its limitations, especially if you're continuing to engage in risky behaviors. So we put this panel of speakers together, and these were the people who were also being cared for on the other end of the organization. And it was an interesting and very powerful way of letting people realize and see firsthand that there are people in our community living with HIV and AIDS, that they range, that they were young people and older people, people of color, people that were heterosexual, women. This was very critical, that people could see that there was a whole range. It wasn't just stereotypical gay men, it was all kinds of people. And of course it was frightening for people to see that as well. And yet at the same time, we knew that it broke through their denial, that this wasn't happening, or this was only something that was happening in New York and San Francisco, but that it was happening right here in our community. So that was one piece of the HIV prevention. People went out and passed out condoms at bars and clubs and communities, and it got very creative. There were some people who went as far as going out to heavy cruising zones in parks or beaches where gay men were known to meet each other, and distributed condoms there. And sometimes, just to prove that it was a useful activity, they would go back on Saturday morning or Sunday morning and they would see, are there any used condoms lying around? Let's count them up. It's like, oh, well, we passed condoms out here last month, and this month we're coming back and we're counting them up, and we found a dozen used condoms. So there's some evidence there that they're working, that people are using condoms and that distributing condoms does work. It sounds kind of bizarre perhaps, or avant-garde, but in fact it was a direct field experience and research that I was pretty impressed with and proud of. That is one of the things that we did at the Santa Cruz AIDS Project. So,
tell me about the culture at the Santa Cruz AIDS Project.
Well, it was in the beginning very community grassroots oriented, and it needed to be that way because there was no funding. And it was a community response. And I believe that one time the RAND Corporation cited the Santa Cruz AIDS Project as an ideal response of a small community to this particular epidemic. I'm not sure I could find that, but I'm pretty sure that that's a fact. We held together as a group and as a community in the face of this by taking care of each other and kind of being real and working together every day. I know I worked 10-hour days, often 5 and 6 days a week, and so did the people that I was working with. And you know, there was a concept of taking care of each other and self-care through all of this, and I'm not really sure how exactly we did that. I think we did that by being real and being authentic and allowing ourselves the time and the energy and the space that we needed to just be real and be with each other. Eventually, as the organization grew and grew, and this is true of many social service agencies and AIDS projects, I mean, as more and more professionals got hired, it became a little more calcified and structured and employee-oriented and a little less client-oriented. But I mean, that is very typical of all social services organizations, and SCAP is not any different. I think we saw ourselves as doing the best possible work that we could and having a lot of support from the community. I don't really think that we ever got any community negative backlash. I don't think the AIDS project itself ever got any, nobody threw a brick through our window or did anything like that that I can remember. It might have happened. If it did, it was a rare thing and I would have blocked it out and forgotten it. But yeah, we took care of each other. And I can't remember exactly what that looked like, other than a lot of time for being real and being connected. And of course, living already in a small community, we all knew each other anyway. I mean, Santa Cruz is a small place. There's maybe one bar or club, maybe two. There was once a time when there were 3 gay bars all at the same time in Santa Cruz. So if you went out to socialize on a weekend, you ran into the people you worked with and your clients all at the same time. And so there was only the possibility of being real. There wasn't so much possibility of professional distancing as you might do in a larger city or in a more professional environment. It just wasn't really a deep option, and it was not something I was really ever deeply oriented in anyway. My orientation has been always more towards community organizing, and that's what we did. I do know that the AIDS project also had a very strong steering committee or board of directors that was concerned and about making sure that we had the funding that we needed, and as well that the staff and the clients were all cared for and the volunteers were all cared for in the best way possible. We often would have, at a certain point, a volunteer acknowledgement picnic in the summer, which was 150, 200 people. I mean, it was kind of a love fest. So we were supported by the community at large greatly, I think. People were financially generous and generous with their sensibility about it all. So, yeah.
Would you mind reading this?
Sure.
And telling us about it?
Sure. Well, this is from winter of 1989, fairly early in the epidemic, relatively. Well, I'm going to say it's the middle of the epidemic, but this is part of the SCAP report, and I'm just going to read a couple paragraphs here. I cannot say exactly what the AIDS epidemic is all about, and I mistrust those with simple theories or pat answers. I believe the AIDS epidemic is about very different things for different people. Yet I also believe there are aspects of commonality among many of these factors. But I don't want to begin to explain any of them. Instead, I want to discuss one observation I have made regarding differences I've noted between my gay and lesbian friends and acquaintances who have gotten directly involved in AIDS work and those who have not. The gay men and lesbians I know who are more directly involved seem to have more opportunities to discuss their feelings and difficult situations. They seem to understand sadness and happiness and know how to move between the two for life's harmony and balance. I don't think the gays and lesbians who volunteer at SCAP are better people. I just think they are more involved with the AIDS epidemic, and because of their involvement, something about them seems more empowered around many of life's issues. So, when I wrote that, what I really was trying to say is that we weren't particularly heroic in the work that we did. We were just more engaged. And we got a lot of benefit out of it. At least I'm going to talk for myself. I did. I mean, one of the direct benefits I got was that I had the privilege of being able to be directly engaged in something that, as I mentioned earlier, was absolutely terrifying for me. Something that I thought was going to kill me. Something that killed about 100 of my friends and then about 200 clients. So around 1991, at the end of my 4 years at the Santa Cruz AIDS Project, I'd lost approximately 300 people. I stopped counting at a certain point, and I stopped writing their names down on a sheet of paper because it just was all too much. And I think the benefit of doing the work directly comes in having the privilege of being able to, well, 2 things. One, I got to do my activism in a very direct way, and that was a tremendous privilege. And as I say in here, I got to feel my feelings, my highs and my lows. There was less denial when you're going to a funeral or you're at the bedside of somebody that's dying of AIDS, or you're working with volunteers who are dramatically inspiring you because of their generosity, or the community because of their generosity. And I would say that the success I had at the AIDS Project and surviving the whole AIDS epidemic was being able to keep my heart open. I think that it would be easy, and was easy, for people to go in denial, shy away, avoid. And as I'm saying here, I don't think that's a bad way of coping with the epidemic. I don't think any less of people who coupled up and stayed away from AIDS and backed up a little bit during the epidemic. Anything that people needed to do to survive, I think, is reasonable, sacred, and valid. I just happen to have a go forward and charge into it kind of mentality and personality. And my real success, I think, was keeping my heart open and continuing to love. Even though it broke my heart over and over and over to lose people who were so young, so beautiful, so talented, so capable, and for really just the sake of a stupid virus that took them out. It was very heartbreaking, very traumatizing in some ways. And if I hadn't had the community that I had here at the Santa Cruz, and the strength that we had, and the community of the Santa Cruz AIDS Project, and my own personal spiritual community of the Radical Fairies, I certainly would not have been able to have done this work for 4 years, let alone to have gone on and do 8 more years of it in different other fields. It's really about community. It's about being together. It's about loving each other. It's about being strong in the face of devastation. It's about being brave in the face of tremendously terrifying situations of not knowing. It's a very odd thing to be at a retreat and be in a circle, and to realize that when we meet again in 6 months or a year, some of these people here are going to be dead. They're not going to be here. It's an odd thing. It's a very odd thing. I know other people and gay people around the world are suffering all kinds of other traumas today, but back then that was our trauma, and very, very frightening. So thanks for letting me read that. I do think that I still quote today from time to time that it was this great privilege of mine to be able to do this work, and I got the great benefit of being able to be alive in the moment and make a difference in as much of a way as I possibly could. So, yeah, thank you. So I had a partner during the AIDS epidemic here named Gary Reynolds. He was about 7 or maybe 10 years younger than me, something like that. He was a super bright young man. He was going to UC Santa Cruz. He transferred up from UCLA. He'd been infected with the HIV virus when he was 19 at UCLA, and he was enrolled in the UCLA men's study. I think it might have been called the LA men's study, which was basically what's considered a natural progression of the disease study. So they found, 1,000 gay men, a large number of whom were HIV positive, and/or their spouses. I was enrolled in that study as well, because I was his spouse, even though I wasn't HIV positive. And they followed them naturally for a very long time. And so Gary was up here, and we got together as partners, and he was very tall and thin, big brown eyes, and kind of captured my heart at a certain point. We became partners because in part he was very brilliant, and partly because he stalked me and he won me over. He wooed me over with his brilliance and his irascible nature and his irreverent comments and his anti-war nature and all the other things that young activists would do. And Gary wanted to become the AIDS poster boy. He was willing to become the AIDS poster boy. He was not one of these people that was willing to go into a denial or shame cycle. He was wanting to be out and gay and proud, and that included his AIDS. So he was an outspoken activist up at the university and in the community, and I think he was on the speakers panel for a while. I'm not sure. He might have been too hot to handle for the group because he was so outspoken and so irreverent about so many things. He unfortunately got sicker and sicker. He wasn't particularly brilliant at taking his medication. Of course, the medication that I wanted him to take was, at the time, was AZT, which turned out to be, he was given more, as they all were at the time, given more of a dosage than anybody could really handle. AZT was a cancer drug, chemotherapy that they pulled out of the mothballs and experimented with to see if it would work for AIDS, which it didn't really work. And the doses that they gave people probably hurried a lot of people to their deaths. There was a lot of experimentation on people with AIDS. That's another whole other story that was very tragic. Gary was suspicious because he was a very, very expansive reader. He could read the entire New York Times on a Sunday afternoon, and often did, and then give me a little summary about what was important that happened around the world. Even though I was well-read myself, he outdid me. And so he knew that AZT, he had a suspicion and knew that AZT probably wasn't that good for you, so he didn't take it on a regular basis. And he was suspicious of other medications. And he worked with his doctor, but he also was mistrustful of the medical care that he was getting. He didn't think it was all working that well. And he was also pretty resigned to knowing that he wasn't going to survive. And so the community, as he got sicker and sicker, the community at some point wanted to honor Gary in his outspokenness and in his activism and his willingness to be who he was in this very deep, authentic way. And so when June came around one year, I guess it would have been 91, because that's the year that he died, they decided that they would have a grand marshal at the gay parade here. Now, they'd never had a grand marshal before. They really made up that position because they wanted to honor Gary in some way. And they've had grand marshals ever since, one or two. So Gary was given a diagnosis in January of February of lymphoma. And he was aphasic, meaning he couldn't really talk anymore, which was a huge loss because he was so brilliant. But he was still present. And he was emaciated. He was 6 foot and about 98 pounds, so he didn't look very good. But the community wanted to honor him, and he was given about 6 or 8 weeks to live. That was in February. But being 26, he had a very strong life energy, life force. So here we are in June, and Gary was still there. And he had a very devoted caregiver named Jeffrey Flansbaum, who just loved and was devoted to Gary, and looked at me several times and questioned me, as like, are you pushing to keep him alive when we should be letting him go? And I said, well, let's go ask him. Let's go see if he wants to take his medication and drink his food and drink his water and eat his food and keep going. And Gary indicated that he did. So we kept going to the extent that he needed to keep going. And that was including the experience of being the Grand Marshal in the gay parade. So the gay parade comes around, and he had a buddy, and he had this caregiver, Jeffrey, and then me, and we thought, what are we going to do? So we got a convertible for him, Gary Reynolds, Grand Marshal, on the side of the parade, and we put him in a jacket and a top hat, and back of the convertible he sat, and he went down the whole Pacific Avenue in the parade and waved to people to the best that he could. His buddy and I kind of whispered to each other, now, don't let him know that if anything happens to him during the parade, he'd probably make the New York Times for dying in the middle of a parade. So we kind of joked about that. You know, there was a lot of black humor that got us by. You asked earlier about the culture of the Santa Cruz AIDS Project. We laughed as much as we cried because even though the whole thing was horrible, there was a lot of humor and a lot of absurdity in it all. And humor was a way of surviving it all and a way of expressing and releasing. And it was a very important and vital way of getting through our days. And so we whispered and joked about that. And we also thought it was a little bit like the movie Bernie, Our Weekend with Bernie, where I think there's a guy that's dead and they take them on a weekend vacation anyway. So we felt like this was on the edge of macabre, actually taking a person who was so fragile and so weak and could no longer even speak and putting him on a top hat and making him the grand marshal of the parade. But he was present and he was with us, and you could see it in his eyes that he was present and he was with us. And he could shake his head yes or no, although I was never 100% sure if he really understood the implications of everything that I asked him. But I assume that he did because it seemed to be appropriate at the time, most of the time. So we got him through the parade, and it used to end at that time at the park in front of the county building. And we wrapped him up in a blanket, and because it was cool air, even though it was a sunny day, but being completely emaciated, he needed to stay warm. So he had a pillow and he was propped up and he was enjoying the concert that was happening as part of the gay ceremony or the gay rally that day. And we knew he was because we heard him singing along. He was a musical person as well, and we heard him singing along with the acrobats, or I should say the musicians, and following everything. And I would say about 200, 300 people came by that day that knew him and came by and said hello and goodbye and acknowledged him. And of course, a lot of people were a little horrified to see somebody so emaciated and fragile out laying on the lawn wrapped up in a blanket. It was an intense and confrontational experience to encounter somebody that limited, physically limited, out in public. But he made it through the afternoon, and we, bundled him up and we got him home. And that night, it was an exhausting day for him too, given that, he'd already surpassed his life expectancy by 4 months in terms of what was projected. And so that night we went to bed. I was still lying in the double bed next to him. Often, many nights, I would sleep next to him, even though he was such a fragile being at that time. And that night he had his last breath at about 1:10 in the morning. And so I called one of his best friends, Thomas, who was leaving for Paris the next day, and I said, "Hey, he died. You should come over now and say goodbye, because this is the time, he's gone." That was his last breath. He died in my arms. He was singing, actually. It was hard to make it out, but I could tell that he was singing. He died in my arms. I said, "It's okay, you can take your breath. It's time to let go." He died. Thomas came over that night, and the next morning we let people know that Gary had died. And of course it was a dramatic headline. Grand Marshal of Gay Parade dies the next day. And he would have loved that. He wanted to be the AIDS poster boy, and he would have loved all the notoriety and the heroism of what it looked like. And about 100 people came over to, say goodbye to him in person the next day. And that's what happened to Gary. That was the end of his grand kickoff, way of saying goodbye, which is pretty dramatic. And it's something that he would have wanted, and that's what he got. And the community provided that for him, and a sensibility of kindness and caring and compassion and intelligence. So it's very, very dramatic, yeah. Well, that's what happened to Gary. Yeah, so. Yeah, you're welcome.
What are the modern implications of the AIDS crisis?
It's a great question. I'm glad you asked me that. I think today that the AIDS epidemic is still a deep, deep, deep impact on the shadow of queer culture, more than young people understand, because they can't see it, they didn't feel it. But we all inherit culture. Culture is passed down from generation to generation, and in heterosexual culture, you get it from your parents and grandparents. In queer culture, we get it often through the media, sometimes through those that are older than us, but sometimes just through the media that we inherit. And, so I'm 67. I've had the privilege of surviving all of this. I said earlier that it started to unfold in my late 20s. I stepped away from working directly in the AIDS epidemic or the AIDS crisis after about 15 years. That was about 2000, 2001, 2002, somewhere around there. I just needed to stop. I had attended too much death and dying, and I thought 15 years was enough, and 300 people dying is enough, and I don't want to go to another bedside and be there for somebody that's dying. And I thought, well, that's your job as a social worker, and if you're not going to do it, maybe you're done. And that's true, that's what happened to me. I was done and went on to another career, yet another career. So, but I've watched the unfolding of it, and you know, in the gay male community, the next thing that took over was probably the drug meth epidemic. And I think the meth epidemic was a direct result or direct response to the AIDS crisis, which was so horrifying. There was a complete shattering of the direction of what was going on in the gay community when the AIDS epidemic befell us. I can talk about it, for example, in the subcontext of the radical fairies. When I first met the fairies, prior to the AIDS epidemic unfolding, we were talking, as I said earlier, about feminism and the challenging capitalism and class structures, and looking at black liberation, and looking at people of color's liberation, and talking about building a future society based on doing away with so many of these isms and also other problems. And then the AIDS epidemic kind of shattered everything, and for at least 15 years, maybe 20, that dominated everybody's experience. It was about surviving, it was about recovering if we had lost so many people, which was true for a lot of people. And it was about not getting infected and doing anything we had to do to not get infected. And that left a lot of people broken and distracted. And then there was the drug epidemic, and some epidemics of silence, where I think people didn't know how to talk about the AIDS epidemic. I remember the experience of being in the Castro in San Francisco and having it be the most vibrant queer place imaginable, to it being a place of doom and gloom and darkness, where you saw people who were gaunt and looking like they weren't going to be around very long, and people who were depressed and didn't look each other in the eye, and the sense of vivaciousness of that place was gone or had dried up. So I think that the younger generation today doesn't really quite realize what happened in terms of the depth of the emotional impact. I mean, you can read about it, you can see it, you can watch We Were Here, that very profound documentary that was made by David Weissman about the San Francisco version of the Santa Cruz, or the San Francisco AIDS crisis. You can see that movie and you can watch it, but you don't necessarily know what the total implications were. And it's hard to fill it all in. I rather say that it's similar to those people who are grandchildren of people that were impacted by the Holocaust. You'll hear people talk about, yeah, my grandparents died in the Holocaust, my parents were traumatized, and it's in our family, and we talk about it or we don't talk about it, but you know that that family was forever changed, forever implicated by that. And I think this is also true of the AIDS epidemic in terms of people who are 20 or 23 or 35 years old today. They're impacted by it, but they don't exactly know how. It's a difficult thing to draw a direct line. It's kind of an emotional thing that's missing. There's a gap there. One of the things that I noticed in Portland and some other communities on the West Coast is that there's a much stronger, it seems to me, a much stronger reverence, for example, for older people. And certainly in the male community, where there is traditionally been an emphasis on youth and beauty, which is what they talk about American culture and queer culture and gay boy culture. It's all about youth and beauty. There's a whole counterpoint to that, where there's a great deal of young men who are very interested in knowing and embracing their elders. And I'm not sure if that would have happened anyway or not, but I do think that there's a sensibility of understanding that this is a generation that survived something momentous and incredible and unbelievable, and has a sense of history, lived history, that only they can tell us about, that only they can share with us. And I do think it impacts and informs that intergenerational connection. I do know in the sub-community of the Radical Fairies, this sense of intergenerational experience is very rich and profound and rewarding for everybody. I was just at a gathering this summer, and there were 30% of the gathering was over 60. And there were people that were in their late 70s and in their 80s, which is pretty remarkable considering it's a camping out in the woods gathering for 9 days. And those people wouldn't be there if they didn't feel welcomed and revered and encouraged and engaged and fully alive with the entire experience. And of course, going the other direction generationally, there were plenty of participants who were down in their 40s, 30s, and even 20s. So, you know, what exactly does this inform the AIDS epidemic? I think it informs a sense of resiliency and strength and historical perspective. And again, as I wrote earlier in that article in the RF or the Lavender Reader, it's difficult to put a single finger on it and say, well, it meant this or it meant that. I think it meant a lot of different things to a lot of different people. But there is a sense of community resiliency that we have that we didn't have before that. A lot of people can draw a line to our successes in the mainstream gay rights movement of getting gay marriage and getting anti-discrimination laws and getting protection for the military. Not all things that I'm deeply in support of, but I do think that civil rights is important and equal rights is important. A lot of that can be ascertained or can be drawn to the humanizing process of what the AIDS epidemic did for America in general. I think America did wake up to the fact that this was their sons and daughters and their people who were dying of this ghastly disease and not pariahs. And I think the AIDS epidemic in so many ways humanized us from a perception of indulgent men and indulgent people just being hedonistically going off our own way to people who were spiritually engaged with each other, taking care of each other, struggling for survival, in a sense being an underdog in society and kicked around and battered about, you know, from legislative and moral majority types. And I think that the AIDS epidemic did do that on a big, grander scale. And of course, you know, we haven't even touched on the whole phenomenon of ACT UP, which was another deep, deep sense of phenomenal empowerment, where lesbians and gay men came together to take their lives in their hands in terms of charting their own course and not letting the medical establishment and the governmental medical establishment determine who is going to get what medications when. Many people will tell you, including old doctors and public health officials, probably even Anthony Fauci, that the AIDS epidemic and the ACT UP movement in particular profoundly changed who would get access to experimental medications when people had life-threatening illnesses. I think our culture's changed. I also think that the way that we honor death and dying with the sensibility of service of celebration of life versus the mourning of a funeral and who would be in charge of that service was profoundly changed by the AIDS epidemic. To the extent that there is a reason that queer people exist in the culture at large, and I'm one that believes that it's very true that there's a very powerful reason that we're here. We're not an accident. We're not random. We exist in all cultures. We exist historically in all eras and epochs. We're here for a reason. I think we are culture-centered, cultural leaders and center the culture in so many ways. I think we did have a profound impact on the culture at large. And I think that includes younger queer people. But how to most articulate that, I wish I could do a better job. Because it's difficult for me to say in any simple, one broad brush stroke what that is. But I would say that it has something to do with a sensibility of fierceness, the ability to overcome and to tackle difficult challenges, a sense of erasing the sensibility that we're just ill, sick, vulnerable pariahs, that we're not a strong community. The idea alone that we are a community, which I think was first started by the work of Harry Hay when he started the Mattachine Society, and the conceptualization that we are in fact a community and not just a group of individuals who are criminals, sick, and perverted and immoral, which is how society saw us up until the 60s and 70s. That has all changed, and this was clearly, certainly the AIDS epidemic was a trial by fire. And I will say that when the pandemic happened of the last virus that we just had, a lot of gay men that I knew had trauma responses, like, oh, here we go again. And a lot of gay men I knew were way better informed and much better prepared on how to take care of themselves and how to respond to an epidemic that had so many similarities. The similarities of, we don't really know exactly what the facts are. You've got to be careful. It might kill you. The government might be giving us accurate information and they might not. We need to stick together. We need to take care of each other. There was a tremendous similarity. And of course, there was the distinction that in the AIDS epidemic, it was a particular sub-community that was most impacted, and not the community of the whole country at large, or what was sometimes called the general community. So there were distinctions, but there were also significant similarities as well. And I certainly saw that when we started dealing with that most recent pangendered epidemic. So I don't know if that's it. That's what I can tell you about that.